Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's program, which is a conversation with my wonderful colleague, Professor Nahid Siamdoust, about the film Sansur more broadly, but also to put some of the material from the film in a context where we rethink and also revisit the women life freedom movement. So I want to thank you so much all for coming today. And I'm going to introduce Professor Siamdoust briefly. Nahid Siamdoust has been researching and reporting about Iran as an academic and journalist for over 20 years. She's currently an assistant professor of media and Middle East studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She earned her PhD from the University of Oxford and was the inaugural Yashater postdoctoral associate in Iranian Studies at Yale University. She was also a visiting professor in the Anthropology of Religion at Harvard Divinity School. Professor Siamdoust is the author of Soundtrack of the Revolution, The Politics of Music in Iran, which was published in Stanford at Stanford University Press in 2017, a wonderful book. And her more recent work sort of follows up on that by exploring the role of music in more recent protests. Previously, she was an Iran correspondent for Time magazine and a Middle Eastern correspondent for Al Jazeera International. Her commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, New Lines Magazine, Foreign Policy, BBC, and NPR. And in 2023, she launched the podcast series Women Life Freedom, All In on Iran, which captures and archives important knowledge on the ongoing uprising in Iran. And we're going to put that in the chat for you so you can follow up and listen to Nahid's podcast. And also I've put in the chat a more recent article of hers that's in open access in the International Journal of Middle East Studies about the role of music in the women life freedom protest. So thank you, Nahid, for joining us. I'm so thrilled to have you today. And also I look forward to being in conversation with you both about this film and about some of its relevance to the issues you've been working on.
Thank you so much, Professor Karim, Persis John, for having me. I really appreciate this invitation, and I'm very happy to see so many faces among so many friends and colleagues among those attending. Thank you all for being here.
So I want to invite you to say a little bit about the film Sansur. Hopefully you all got a chance to watch it. It was available streaming for the past 5 days. If you didn't, I think you can still watch it today. But Nahid, I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the film by Mustafa Heravi, who's a filmmaker based in Netherlands, and also to perhaps give us what you think is relevant in terms of thinking about the way in which censorship has played an ongoing role, particularly since the 1979 revolution, and the particular impact it's had on women.
Thank you so much for those points of discussion. I wonder how many of the participants here have actually seen the documentary, but it's an interesting film. It starts with a woman in Hormuz in the very south of Iran and her making a niqab, a beautiful niqab that she wears. She herself is not from Hormuz. She's an artist who wanted to have a space that was freer for her to be who she could be, and landed in Hormuz because she thought it was sort of a bit on the margins and less under the eyes of the powers that be. And so that's how she ends up there. And it really sort of, delineates the departure, the untethering of 5 women ultimately from the core of the censorship and the power. So from Iran. So we have the artist in Hormuz. We then move on to a teacher who couldn't continue being a teacher in Tehran because of the way in which she cared to really support and enlighten and educate the girls who she talked to, the freedoms that she gave them. And then we move on sort of to, to Istanbul. For many Iranian expats, the first stop out of Iran, to a reporter who was persecuted, whose house was raided and whose files were stolen, who really came under the eyes of the authorities because of the photography that she did in the provinces, on the outskirts, sort of on the margins of Iran, right? She did lots of photography of the Baluch, the poverty and disparity in Baluchistan, Kurdistan, Azerbaijan, Fars province. So she had these files and also these, photos of the protests, and ultimately that got her into the crosshairs of the authorities, and she had to she left Iran for Istanbul, and then we move out into Europe. So these are, a musician among them, an athlete, and ultimately Golshifteh Farahani, whom I'm not exactly sure where she's being filmed, but I believe it's in France that she's being filmed at this point, which was her first stop of sort of migration out of Iran. So it's an interesting film because we have we have the niqab, which again, aside from this distance from the home country, also symbolizes the untethering of these women and their bodies from the centers and censorship. And the film points then to the kinds of the diverse activities that these women do that gets them into trouble, right? Whether they're artists, teachers, photographers, journalists, actors, and athletes, at some point, when they get to a point where they can no longer be contained and put up with the kind of censorship that's being imposed on them, they find themselves in trouble. And in the case of 3 of these people, of leaving. And this film, of course, is is one of the more interesting aspects of the film, I think, is the play that he does. And these women also, I'm not sure if they were prompted to comment on this, or if this was something that came naturally to them. But, the comments that we hear from many of them about the niqab being both constricting and restricting on them and their agencies as women, and as they're within their personhood, as well as at some point after a few days of wearing the niqab as being in some ways comforting. So sort of the binding power of, the cover that the niqab gave them, the binding powers of, I suppose, these restrictions, sort of commenting on, the productive nature of power and restriction in and of itself. And this is, of course, important because when we see the women comment on the political restrictions on them, they also often comment on social and cultural and religious restrictions that would be present regardless of the political structures or the government, right? So these restrictions, these impositions by the state are, of course, severe, but they have tentacles and roots elsewhere in the culture as well. Right, in the patriarchal culture and the misogynist culture, in the ways in which Iranian women for generations have been restricted. And this is something that Golshifteh Farahani comments on when she says, what I was doing was not just for me. This was my body rebelling. This was my mother's body rebelling. This was my grandmother's body rebelling. She was pointing in particular, not very explicitly, but she was commenting on the nude photography that emerged of her in about 10 years ago on the cover of a French magazine. So, the film very much also captures this notion of a centralizing and, the centralizing and homogenizing force of the Iranian state, which in many ways has a very specific view and constraints on what is permissible for Iranian women and Iranians at large. We can imagine that the restrictions that are imposed on women, and these women experience in the film and talk about, also apply to men to a lesser degree, right? Whether it's for example, for the teacher, she gets ultimately into trouble because she doesn't go to the, Namos Jome or the political rallies that exist. She doesn't shepherd her students to all these government-sponsored events and whatnot. So really, anybody who comes into trouble with the hegemony, the hegemonizing, and sort of a homogenizing power of the state at some point finds themselves restricted, and kind of expels these women into the diaspora, so that today we see a very rich and layered Iranian diaspora across the world. People who have left for all kinds of reasons, right? Who found themselves unable to cope with the kind of narrative that was being imposed on them by the state in terms of who they could and could not be within the country itself. Of course, the film speaks very much to the woman life freedom movement in that the film ultimately, in centering women, speaks to this reckoning, to this national reckoning that happened, whereby Iranian women on the front lines showed everybody that without their freedom, without them having full emancipation and freedom and justice, no Iranian would. That was basically the central message of the woman life freedom movement. And we see this across, these women are not just single individuals, their families are affected, their brothers are affected, their husbands are affected, they're torn apart from their loved ones. And it's clear from the narratives that we hear that, the restrictions that are imposed on them, though to a greater degree, are imposed on the rest of the population as well. So the untethering of these women from that central power, from those restrictions, of course, speaks very much to the woman life freedom movement. And I'll leave it at that, Persis John.
I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the title of the film, Sansur, and thinking a little bit about the ways in which censorship is collapsed with other forms of repression, right? There's the freedom to speak, censorship of images, censorship of the body. There's all those things that especially Iranian artists have to contend with. But then there's the choice that the filmmaker made to feature only women, and therefore that idea that censorship is in some ways a more severe category of rules and restrictions that women have to contend with. A little bit of what you're saying, but I was scratching my head a little bit thinking about the title of the film, and if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, Sansur is something that we Iranians is such a key term in the lives of all Iranians, right? Whether it's a film that's being censored or a whole music, a piece of literature. So the degree to which very just like the woman life freedom movement revealed this, simple pleasures of life, normal pleasures of life, right? Living a normal life was in many ways censored, right? That's what we saw, for example, in that photograph of the two women eating breakfast in a South Tehran eatery, right? It was the most normal image you could have of two women having breakfast together, yet without hijab. And that photograph was banned, and the photographer was, got into trouble and was thrown into jail. But in some ways, I think the film, in speaking to these women, none of whom are doing, anything extreme, right? By all counts, they are just being teachers and artists. And in the case of the musician, she's just playing her music on the streets. In the case of the athlete, she is basically just saying no to going to political rallies and doing all the revolutionary requirements, right? Basically, as if you want to function and have a role that is somewhat more pronounced and visible, you have to you have to say yes to the power structures that be, to the very core ideology of the Islamic Republic, at least to have that pretense of as if you abide by it, or you will be censored, right? And I think we see this among these characters whom Heravi, Mustafa Heravi, the filmmaker, chooses to highlight. He's not going for the most, famous opponents of the Islamic Republic. He's going for very much everyday characters. So in the centrifuge of power that is able to expel so many women who are just going about their lives trying to make a living as fairly sort of average kind of activities, if it can expel them, who else does it can it expel? And I think this is something that's been visible for a while now, at least within the political circles, right? To the extent that Hassan Rouhani himself, two-time president of the Islamic Republic, is disqualified. He's censored, to the extent that, I don't want to talk about, all of that, but it goes to the very core and has these layers and layers and layers. The centrifugal sort of, censor system of the Islamic Republic becomes so visible in the lives of these fairly ordinary women, right? Remarkable women, but not doing anything that is, that has raised them in some ways to the national consciousness, right? They're not super celebrities or prominent people. These are women just trying to live their lives.
Yeah. And I think the other thing about the hard choice of making the decision to leave, that's the only alternative, is one of the things that's sort of poignant about the movie is the idea that these women can't sustain either their livelihoods or a sense of well-being. And in several cases, the women talk about how it takes them a long time to feel comfortable in a new place. Obviously, moving to another country, learning a language, those elements, but it also feels like they're speaking to the surveying eye of the state that they have become so accustomed to. And the interesting thing about the two women that are filmed in Iran is that they've made the choice to stay there and have had to pay also a high price, right? The woman who moves to Hormuz basically takes up a lifestyle that is more in alignment with the state's vision for women. And then the other woman who becomes, she works in a wood shop, almost like she has to wear a mask because all the particles in the wood shop become the mechanism by which she has to wear a mask to prevent health issues. And she, of course, wears a mask outside. But I thought it was really interesting how the mask becomes a metaphor for the two women who remain in Iran for a form of, as you pointed out with the niqab, a kind of security, right?
That's right. And, the first one, she points to the way in which the niqab is both, can cover up, but also can really put these women on the spot, right? Because the niqab can also draw these women out as, whether it's as she said, like it's also a very sort of stunning visual thing. So at the same time that this niqab is giving them cover, it's also exposing them in some ways. And, as to the notion of these women's departure from the homeland, there's so many, there's several really kind of heartbreaking moments in the film, especially I found with the musician who says, I love this song Layli, and I just was, wishing I would sing this in Iran because I knew people would be able to sing along. I never got to sing it in Iran because, she was playing the melodica, but she wasn't full on singing in the streets when she was in Iran. But then she says, here I can sing it. Here I'm free to sing it. And I'm not scared of Ershad or, the police or the, city municipality people coming in being vicious with me. But of course, nobody can sing along with me here. Right? Nobody here can sing along with me singing this song that I was desiring to sing all my life to people who would know how to sing along to it. Yeah, it's it's this notion of the further that they are from the home country, the less the less visible the mask becomes in their lives. I mean, with Golshifte Farahani at the very end, the mask is completely gone. And with the photographer, it's at the with a journalist photographer, it's at the very end that she, Yasaman Khaliqian, it's at the very end that she takes off the mask. But it's that compromise with, on both ends, there's a compromise for the kind of lives that they lead. Departure from the homeland versus some kind of imposition of, and compromise with those restrictions.
Yeah, and the other thing that I was really noting was the sort of the economics of compliance, that for these women, the ability to function and make a living in their professions in Iran, the journalist, certainly, but even the athlete, right? If she's a professional athlete, a cricket player, and she has to go along with the state, otherwise she loses any kind of sponsorship. And I think that's the other part of the film that to me felt sort of profound to see, is the idea that women are already compromised by their circumstances, and then they become circumscribed by more economic hardship once they decide not to go along with the restrictions, or even in going to another country, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the teacher, she explains it well. She says, in Iran, in order to have any kind of government post, you have to go through a gozinesh. And, that's a highly sort of security related process of approving a person's character and their commitment to the Enqilab and to the revolutionary founder Khomeini. And, there are all these sort of, there are all these requirements which one must check in order to get this gozinesh, to be able to have one of these positions, government positions, to have an economically viable life that is given within the huge public sector that Iran has, right? So, I mean, obviously, now she's a private person and economically, and does her own, makes her own money through her wooden sculptures, but she could no longer basically be somebody who benefited from the state, which she still has to support with her taxes, where she still has to live, the consequences of which she still has to, live through, and yet she will not be a beneficiary of being able to be part of the public sector, basically. And the same applies to the athlete, right? Mm-hmm. And this has happened to, this happens much more frequently, as we saw, for example, in the, at the beginning of the Woman Life Freedom movement with the climber whose name is escaping me. But I know you remembered. I don't know if you remember her name, but, yeah. But it also happens to plenty men. And so this is really, sports is a really fascinating space to watch when it comes to Elnaz Ajavi, thank you. Yes, she ultimately was, compromised in some ways, because she was forced, as much as anyone could be forced in the public eye, to present this image that she stood with the male, authorities, sports authorities. That image was released of her, right? And yet, to say it was an accident, that she lost she forgot to put on her headscarf in the heat of the thing, she forgot it. But by all accounts and purposes, based the way she gave her interviews, the way that she looked at the camera, or didn't look at the camera when these photos were made, she made her message known. It was clear to anybody watching that this was not just a forgetfulness. This was a very clear sign in support of the woman life freedom movement. And yet, since then, she has lost her privileges. Her parents' home was razed to the ground. So, this force that we see in this, the force that we see in this documentary is brutal, right? It can eliminate lives. It can eliminate people's livelihoods. It is brutal. And so these women pay a heavy price when they go into the diaspora. Every single one of those women, it was clear from the way they were relaying their stories, every single one of those women would have preferred to stay in Iran.
Yeah, no, it was the woman who appears, is it the first one? No, it's the journalist, right? Who's talking about the flight, the Ukrainian flight that gets shot down. She gets in trouble for reporting on that, of course. And she loses somebody in that flight. So they show that she has 3 objects that she brings with her to, I don't know what country she's in.
At that time, she's in Istanbul. She's in Turkey.
Okay, wait, was that her then? The one who's, yeah, I think that's her. Yeah, she's in Istanbul. And for her, the kind of grief and loss is compounded by this fact that she's lost a friend, I think, or somebody.
Her fiance's sister.
Fiance's sister. Okay. Yeah. And that looms still so large as also another element of the censorship is the Ukrainian flight that was shot down in 2020 as part of that idea that, this is the long arm of the state reaches into the diaspora in so many places, including, a journalist who is probably not reporting on things in Iran anymore, right? Because of her situation. And also because I think what we've seen is that the Iranian state has its mechanisms for silencing or threatening people far away from Iran as well. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, it definitely does that in Turkey. We know that because of what Amir Tatalu's case is a little more complicated, but for sure we know that it has that force in Turkey and has acted out violence against Iranian nationals in Turkey or asked for their extradition to Iran and whatnot. But I think what also surfaces across the film is this sort of landscape of trauma, right? Landscape of trauma writ large across the faces of these women whom we see, writ large in the narratives of their lives, and some of it, the reckoning with that trauma appears to happen, is very much suppressed, like in the case of the photographer who then remembers the scene in which her brother is threatened with a gun to his head because they're going through her stuff and trying to get her laptop and her photographs. And so I think, another prominent sort of theme throughout, though not explicitly expressed, is just this, the vastness of this diasporic trauma, across the different countries.
Yeah. I wanted to tell the audience that the film was started before the pandemic. And what I know is that Mustafa Heravi and his producer, who's a Dutch woman named Reneke van Santen, started it before the pandemic, and then they had to suspend it. So it was completed right as the women life freedom movement erupted. And I read in an interview that, of course, they would have, had they still been in production, they would have changed the film somewhat to accommodate what was happening in Iran, but they had already kind of moved past the point where they could make any serious changes. I want to sort of offer as a opportunity for you to maybe bring that conversation into this as well, to talk a little bit about the role of art in the women life freedom movement, and also your thoughts about where it is today. I did get a quick little direct message from Professor Hamid Nafisi, who wants to say something because he has to leave. So is that okay if we let him comment?
Absolutely. I'm so happy to see Hamid John here.
So Hamid, Nick, can you unmute Hamid Nafisi, please, so he can say? If you all don't know, Professor Hamid Nafisi is a very important person in the realm of Iranian studies and Iranian diaspora studies, and has worked extensively on film, censorship, and forms of popular culture, both in Iran and outside. So we're so happy to see you, Hamid John.
Thank you very much, John and Molly John, both. Very provocative film and presentation. I missed the last, say, 7 minutes of the film, but I'm just surprised that there wasn't any information on the film as to the director's name, or the characters who appeared in there were not identified throughout the film. Maybe they were introduced at the end. I don't know, but anyway, beyond that, in some ways, it seems as though the film was masking itself, was putting a kind of hijab on its own production process as to who was involved in it, and that's very unusual when you're doing a documentary. You want to know who is speaking and from what position they are speaking, and so anyway, that's not a criticism of you. Obviously, it's something with the filmmaker. The other thing that I think is important to point out, both in the film and in your presentation, John, is the bidirectionality of the hijab repression and aesthetics and responses. It is something that and it's control. The government has the control over what people where, what films are made, what novels they write, what kind of music, what kind of behavior in public, and people are not. Interestingly, people are not taking it at face value. They play with it. They constantly negotiate with it and undermine it, undercut it, and so forth. So the film seems to emphasize basically the top-down, one-way direction of the censorship apparatus, while there is a amount of oppositional tactic people, especially the subject people, undertake. For example, you can force people to put the hijab on, but you can't control the gaze, the look. So look has become an important expressive medium, the way people look at each other, even though under chador or under hijab or whatever. And if you apply it to cinema, then you have the gaze plays a very important role. It's the eyes talk, even though they're half covered. The face is covered, the eyes talk, and there is a relay of the gaze. There is a there's also a downcast eyes, when you're shy, when you're in presence of elderly, or when you're in presence of the namzad or so forth, you have to be show respect or strangeness or whatnot. But the gaze also is very playful and very powerful, and it's a gaze. And so, in fact, because of hijab rules, the gaze becomes a more important expressive medium for men and women. And so men also participate in this relay of the gaze. It's not just women So it gives actually women a certain amount of agency. So you both, there's a play at work, and it has become very sophisticated and very playful. So that's one point.
Do
The
you want to
other,
respond? Can
say
we
what?
let Nahid respond to that?
Sure, yeah,
Yeah, just
I
quickly,
can
Hamza,
just
thank
stop.
you so much for that feedback. I really appreciate it. And the first point, there are, Mustafa Haravi is in the credits, and we find out the women introduce themselves by name, not the first two, because their identities are hidden being in Iran and they don't want to reveal their identities. But the other women, they reveal themselves by introducing themselves by name at the end of their sort of, segments. So the credits are there, and everything is. It's because you missed the last 7 minutes of the film that you didn't see the credits and identities of the people. But as to the sort of bidirectionality of the film, I agree. The film has a very specific message, a message that has become really empowered and kind of dominant since the woman life freedom movement, in a way that it's also not healthy, right, in terms of our discourses and the conversations that we have. So I think, if we were to put on a critical lens, as much as I appreciate the documentary, I don't think this film would have been as as relevant for us to or as I don't know. I think before the woman life freedom movement, when women on the streets in Iran really put the hijab issue front and center as a core sort of liberating factor for the liberation of women and Iranians at large on all fronts, when they sort of identified it as one of the key factors of sort of central to that repression, I think it would have been a little bit kind of, anathema, to be honest with you, to have this sort of niqab and the sort of blunt symbolism of the niqab and all of that. So I want to let you continue with your comments, but I agree on that.
Yeah. Well, one last point, I think, I don't want to monopolize it, is the issue of voice. The women, even though, and perhaps because of the imposition of hijab, are very vocal socially and in film. They talk back, they argue, they are very present in public, on buses, in the streets, in movies, and so forth. So the vocal dimension is another aspect that has to be also put in. And then I guess the last thing perhaps is as I mentioned a little bit, but I wanted to emphasize the idea of the gaze, of the way we communicate by looking, because everything else is covered, so to speak, the body and the colors and everything else. Then the gaze becomes really expressive, and films emphasize that, and the voice. Those two, I think, are I think that's what I should just
Hey, thank you,
stop.
Hamid.
Yeah, and the idea that finally that Iranian women and men, many of them, because of these restrictions, they want out. They don't want to play the games. They don't want to do any of that stuff, wasting their times and their lives and their education and so forth. And so they leave the country. And so hence the proliferation of the arts and creativity abroad. Going abroad is sort of like dumping the hijab and all the restrictions and suddenly blossoming. Not that it automatically takes, but the abroad allows people to come to their own, to work hard, to achieve what they want, and to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid Jan.
Thank you, Hamida.
For that.
For one.
So this is a good opportunity. I'm going to give people in the audience the opportunity to ask or, engage with you more directly. But I wonder if you could, because I know you've been following the woman life freedom very actively, and especially through the lens of music and culture. I wonder if you want to say anything to bring this film into a more contemporary moment about what's happening and what you feel some of the impact of the woman life freedom is today.
Yeah, this kind of connects to what Hamid was saying, which is that the film basically leads us through this, gradual progression of women leaving the country in order to gain that kind of freedom, right? To shed the censorship and whatnot. And of course, it kind of elides in some ways the very shedding of censorship and claiming of power and agency that women have carried out through woman life freedom in Iran itself. So I think Hamid has left, but I was hoping we would get into a little bit more of a discussion on that. I appreciate the film. I think each of those people in the film has their own story and their own truth, and obviously they are their truths, and there's we can feel it, we can see it, but the film of course leaves out a lot. It does elide the power of the women who are still in Iran sort of on a daily basis, on a minute, have done it through the woman life freedom, but still on a daily basis carry out massive acts sort of on, together collectively massive acts of disobedience simply by not wearing the hijab, for example, which is now very recurrent in many places, especially sort of center and north of Tehran, and other acts as well. As far as woman life, I think your other question, Persis John, was about woman life freedom and where I see it now. You had a question just before Hamid came on about the centrality of the arts and music. And I think for all of us who've been paying attention to woman life freedom, we know that it was a very creative movement. We know that it was at the core linked to a sort of life force, right? This was a movement that was that incorporated communality, dance, joyousness, all of these things that speak to a life force that opposes basically this a hegemony of the sacrifice of Imam Hussein and Karbala as the highest values. And so that life force is in and of itself creative. And so the arts and music were so central to the expressions that we saw in woman life freedom, because those things are interlinked, right? The arts and sort of the life force and the arts are linked together. Music was extremely prolific. And something else I will say that also is elided, because Hamid also brought up the notion of the voice, is that yes, unfortunately, Kimia Ghorwani, who's got a beautiful voice, she never got to sing Layli on the streets. But the film elides the multiple sort of media verses that Iranians engage in. And so on social media today, you have so many women singing. This is, of course, sort of, avoiding the power of the state through the use of social media. So it doesn't, but again, they can be detained and they can leave themselves vulnerable if they become too prominent. People can be easily found in Iran, and they have gone after people who've become too prominent. So, but the fact that yes, on the streets you can't, but they have mounted this incredible front on social media where the majority of the clips we see, the majority of the new clips and of music and singing that we've seen is by women. I don't know if I left anything out in what you're asking.
I wonder if you could comment a little bit about, I read your piece in IJMIS in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, and you talked about the idea of the birth of the university music genre in the context of the woman life freedom. I wonder if there's still that kind of music being produced in university settings, or if it's gone underground now. And maybe you could say a little bit about what that genre of music looks like for the audience who might not know.
Yeah, I'm sure for people who were paying attention. So first of all, what I call the university music genre is that for the very first time, so prior to leading into the 1979 revolution, students in universities were also, students in universities were also making music, but it really came out of their identities, out of their political identities as leftists, mostly as leftists, or Islamists later, but those were the people who were making music. But during Women Life Freedom, we see sort of disparate groups in different universities making music that is not ideologically bound to any political sort of faction or ideology. It's really just in support of the Women Life Freedom movement. So the lyrics are all about women and women empowerment, and a lot of the music actually is rooted in Latin American or leftist music. Not all of it, but in terms of genre, it's quite diverse. So it is, we can say it's in terms of musical form, it's very diverse. But genre is not just about musical form, right? Genre is about context, is about the content and the spaces for affinity within the music, and so all of that, this music that came out of the universities, I would say was, the most unique sort of genre to come out of the movement, the most unique music genre. We had lots of music all over the place, all different kinds of music. But this seemed to be a kind of cohesive, more or less cohesive genre that was posted on the website, on the Instagram webpage of the university students, which I offer all the links in the journal article, and it is open access, so you can easily access it and go to the links and listen to the music. But mainly, I think the song that people most know is rooted in Un Pueblo Unido, which is a Chilean song that was sung against the Chilean dictator's coup d'etat against Allende. So kind of goes off from there, and these songs became quite prominent.
I just put the article again in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Find the link. So I'm going to turn it to questions from the audience. I saw Kurosh Valenajad had a question about the noise at the end with which people sign off. And Mona said that's the typical noise that when people are closing out a broadcast. I don't know if you have anything to comment about that, Nahid.
Yeah, yes, I heard that too. I didn't note it too much, but yeah, thank you for highlighting that. It's the beep, right? It's out and over.
Yeah. Mona Bilgrami asks if the film has launched already and what has the response within Iran and outside. I seriously doubt it will be shown anywhere in Iran unless somebody in Iran saw our link and watched it. But I'm guessing this is, material that would be considered, inciting and whatever, corrupting. It was produced.
I mean, it doesn't have to be shown in public settings or governs. It can just make if the filmmaker makes it available.
Yes.
And people
so
can.
I can't answer that question, Mona. Just that I think it's been screened the same way we're screening it. If you want to watch it, it's on Good Docs. We rented it so people could watch it, but I don't know what it is to show it outside of a university context. But I think part of the appeal of it is that it does speak to the recent events in Iran, and so it's kind of a good opportunity to also show people who are maybe not familiar with the kind of repression of the state, what happens you know, particularly to women. So I can't comment beyond that. Are there any other questions though? Or Nahi?
I just want to comment on, I think one of the fascinating things for me in watching this film and just generally sort of seeing the shifting discourse on Iran is the extent, and I think that's, you know, Hamid Nafisi, you know, he's studied media for decades, and his, you know, one of his main works was really soon after the revolution. He compiled these volumes on the kind of media that was being created around the time of the revolution and soon after the revolution. And, you know, he and other scholars, you know, have spent a lifetime, myself included, not a lifetime, but, you know, in some of my work, really trying to discuss the ways in which people become secondary producers as consumers. This is a term by Desserteau, but, you know, become secondary producers of the works that they consume, right? In Iran, how they actually take on that kind of agency to give meaning to things, to, you know, Hamid talked about the gaze and the voice, and how, you know, this is not a strictly sort of binary top-down repression that is not opposed and not messed with, and, you know, where people don't get to create their own stories and whatnot. So, you know, I think that's kind of what he was trying to say, that this film kind of gives you the sense that these are powerless people, right, whose only option is leaving the country. And of course, that is not the case. And that is a problematic, you know, sort of supposition that would have not even been uttered before Women, Life, Freedom. But I think, you know, Persis John, because you asked the question of, you know, how this relates to women, life, freedom, it's really the discourse and the paradigm on women, life, on these discussions has really shifted since Women, Life, Freedom, right? Some of the shift is not very healthy. Some of the shift actually encourages us to see things in binary ways, right? To see sort of the all-powerful force of the state and of censorship, which again, you know, denigrates or elides the agency of people in Iran. But I will say that this is a particularly dark moment for Iranians in so many different ways, right? The state has taken them down such a ruinous political path internationally in terms of its foreign policy. First the sanctions, and then the mismanagement and the corruption of the state has led to great impoverishment of Iranians across the board. And so, you know, despite this very hopeful period of the Women, Life, Freedom, where we did in fact see women take that kind of agency onto the street and put their voices out there and whatnot, has led to a moment of, you know, where, you know, things are extremely difficult for the majority of Iranians, and not unlike post 2009, you know, the Green Movement. Whoever can try to figure out a way out is trying to figure out a way out. Although there was also a very strong movement coming from Women, Life, Freedom that we saw, especially among young people, a very intentional movement to say, no, I'm staying right here. This is my country. Enough of, you know, this centrifugal sort of brutal force basically expelling us to the rest of the globe. This is my homeland and I'm staying. And that still exists. If you sort of roam around social media and see the kinds of, you know, posts that are out there, that is a newish thing, right? And that's still out there. Anyway.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the status of, for example, Tumaj Salehi, because I think there's still people campaigning on his behalf, and he's of course one of the better known political prisoners. And I know you follow the kind of news about him. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about his case in particular and how it's relevant to some of the role of the creative response in the Women, Life, Freedom, but also in the particular case of a artist who's very directly engaged with a kind of confrontation with the state in his work.
Yeah, Tumaj Salahi, I mean, he's just so fascinating because he was in some ways he kind of heralded this, he kind of prophesized this movement in some ways, right? When he came out with his Surah Mushbakhar, that was about a whole year before Women Life Freedom, where coming from, a period of silencing of oppositional voices of music and all of that, after having suppressed the musical underground completely, and in the, sort of in the mid 2010s, all of a sudden came this voice that foresaw the end of the Islamic Republic and was so explicit and so bold, that you kind of had to double check to see if this guy was actually in Iran, right? A voice like his did not exist. And so, as we all know, he was detained, he was tortured, and then he was released a few months ago and recorded this stunning video recounting his treatment in prison and in the interrogations. And it was so revelatory because, his whole sort of narrative has been one of defying the kind of fear that this censorship and the state imposes to create that kind of space for openness and for talking about that force. And so he came out and he recorded, I've never seen anything like it, but he sat in front of the camera and just talked about his treatment, the torture that he, sorry, that was a big bug, the torture that he experienced in prison. And soon after, he was captured again, and he's again in prison and probably being tortured again. Not probably, most definitely being tortured again. And so, yeah, he's kind of as far as I'm concerned, he's kind of a singular figure over the last few years, spanning woman life freedom, but not contained to woman life freedom, right? His activism and his creating of that space and that kind of oppositional dissent, this very open dissent, which was brave and really inviting to other people within Iran, sort of predated the woman life freedom movement and is still ongoing.
Yeah. Do you see the woman life freedom movement sort of quietly now operating in these everyday acts of resistance that you mentioned, like women not wearing the hijab? Do you see the potential for it to erupt again? And do you think that the initial impetus of the woman life freedom, the murder of Mahsa Jina Amini, is now in some ways we're in a moment where that idea of the hijab and of the state's control of women has been sort of exposed on a bigger playing field now than previously?
Yeah, I mean, but civil disobedience is happening on a daily basis in Iran, right? And that is sort of the legacy of the woman life freedom movement, is that it revealed this, this hidden transcript that everybody knew of, but hadn't revealed on such a national stage, by exposing its, the moral corruption of the imposition of this piece of cloth, and how it does ultimately play, figures in a central way in the repression of women and the nation at large. But sorry, I actually forget what you asked.
Just what the impact of it is, and will it?
Yeah, I think the impact of it is that, everybody knows that the emperor's naked, right? People talked about it. People knew that on a national level, there was real dissatisfaction and discontent and opposition to the way in which the state ruled and governed the country on all levels. But I think since the woman life freedom movement, and it wasn't just women, I think what was revelatory for the state itself was that these women were supported step by step by their male counterparts. And in fact, if anything, the majority of those people who were out on the streets and were ultimately killed were men, right? They came out in support of that message of woman, life, freedom. So this unity behind that message and behind that voice, this unity that brought together not just men and women on this particular, and it's not a particular message, it's a message of liberation rooted, in the bodies of women. But it was also Iran's minorities, and the film also kind of brings that in a little bit, right? It's I think it's the first woman who mentions that it's the people of Hormuz are being repressed, just like the women. It very much united and brought in the margins of Iran, the minorities of Iran, and united them, and had a very intersectional sort of aspect to it. And so I think all of those things have been revealed on a national. We have never seen such unity across the board in any of the post-revolutionary protests that we have seen. They've all had some aspect of whether they've been student-led or led by reformists or more middle class or labor unions, labor movement. This really truly united people on all fronts. And so I think it poses a grave challenge to the authorities, and that's precise, and they know it, and that's precisely why they have gone on so brutally against some of the protesters that they've captured, the minorities who they're executing. They have not been. I think they understand the challenge of this movement.
Yeah. Okay. There's one comment and one question in the chat. What the comment is from Mona, that she liked the idea of passing on the mask as a device to link the characters and their narratives, but also she was touched by the inverse liberatory effect it had on enabling those women still in Iran to speak, and for the musician who expressed some fondness for having used it. Perhaps she felt better to express herself through the mask, and without it may not have been so vocal. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that. Seems
No, I think Mona is spot on that. Yeah.
And then
it does. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think she just put it perfectly.
Yeah. So Mani also asked a little bit about your hopes for the future of Iran. And somebody else asked about the journalist who appears in the film. And Pune answered that she's in Canada and still very active. So she's not in Turkey.
Right. She has moved on. So my hopes for Iran are, I think I'm an optimist by nature, and I think you could not be if you just looked at that immense power that people and women displayed on the streets against all odds. And so my hope is just squarely just sort of right there in Iran. I think we in the diaspora have a role to play in terms of, educating ourselves and amplifying their voices. But I do believe that in the end, we have seen Iranians rise up and carry out these immense uprisings within just, 40 some years, 45 years now. And no other country in the world can claim to have, no other people in any other country in the world can claim to have done that. So I think there's immense hope among the people in Iran. At least I project that hope. I know it's a very tough time to be an Iranian in Iran right now. But, when you look at sort of the broad strokes of what they've managed to accomplish just over the last 45 years, and when you look at the young generation and how they just don't put up with some of the nonsense, complete nonsense that's imposed on them by these, aging leaders who are completely out of touch with the realities of the world and with the realities of the subjects who they're supposed to be governing, then I think we can be hopeful. These are these are slow processes, and but I believe that any true and lasting change will come from within Iran itself, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. I think the other role that we can play is solidarity without the perception that we know what's good for the people of Iran. I think we saw a lot of that during the Women Life Freedom, that people who'd been outside of Iran for a long time were making assertions about who should be the leader, and to some degree, I think it's a bit of a, miscalculation for people to not see that as long as we're not breathing the oxygen of that kind of repression and also that kind of courage, we're in some ways limited. But what we can do, for example, I mean, I know in the Bay Area, for example, there's still the Bay Area for Iran is still active. There's a lot of campaigns against the executions, which have been happening ongoing. There's also a campaign to free Tumaj Salehi. So there are people who are working outside of Iran on very specific ways of expressing solidarity without the presumption that they have the recipe for what Iran's liberation looks like. And I do think, one of the interesting moments that we're living in right now is where Iran is again the new old boogeyman in the region as the Israel-Hamas war drags on. And the question is, how can we also protect against all of that effort being lost in the Women Life Freedom movement by some, drum beating of war that I think is very concerning to all of us.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's disconcerting that, we have a sort of equivocation, I'm not sure if that's the correct word, of, between, I mean, there are a lot of forces out there trying to basically paint, Hamas as ISIS and Iran as Hamas, and hence also ISIS, and, to call for attacks against Iran itself. We just saw this recently, right, because of the killing of the 3 US servicemen in Jordan. And so, yeah, those war drums are rolling strong. And I don't think, at the end of the day, there's a situation among, in the West, and I think especially in the US, where people often have a hard time distinguishing between the Iranian government and its people. This is not a mistake that Middle Easterners make. It's not a mistake that we Iranians make, right? We're able to sort of distinguish between the US government and the people of the US, or at least we were able to. I don't, but I think sort of, Americans, I'm talking about mainstream. I'm not talking about, university settings or whatever. I'm talking about mainstream America was there to celebrate, Iran's women. And at least some segment of it is now there to call for war with Iran too. So there's this conflation between, that's what decades of demonizing and dehumanizing of an entire people or entire type of people, whether you call it Muslims or Middle Easterners or all those, Arabs or whatever, that's kind of what that produces, is the inability to distinguish and have a more sophisticated approach, the mainstream understanding about a country.
Okay, I'm gonna leave it at that. There's one comment from Kurosh Valenajad who says the next symbol of the movement, where we take the IRA devices for repression and make it a symbol of freedom, is the triangle that was used in concentration camps to mark gay men, and now is proudly worn by LGBTQ plus folks. And I think, speaking to your point, Kurosh, we also saw the element of queerness emerge in this movement in a way that we've never seen it before, which was very interesting. Okay, I think we're gonna close out now because Nahid has a family she has to attend to. So I want to thank you all for being with us. Thank you for your comments. I hope you get a chance to see the movie if you have not already. The link is only viable until tonight. So I'm sorry if you didn't get to see it. I'm sure it'll be available through Good Docs. So thank you, Professor Siamdoust. Please follow Nahid's work on her podcast and on her open access articles. She's one of the best academics I know because she knows how to write well. That journalistic training trained you well, Nahid Jun. And
Thank you so much, Persis Jun. Coming from you, that's a lot. Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation and your very kind comments. Thank you.
thank you. And have a good night, everybody. See you soon.